Hey guys, Billy here coming with another Mythic Plus guide aimed towards Arcane, a spec that a lot of you may not know about and a lot of you are interested in. In my opinion, this expansion in current season, Arcane has been looking the strongest I've ever seen it perform in Mythic Plus. I firmly believe that it's just a sliver behind fire in terms of Mythic Plus damage. So let's dive in. The talents we will be using goes as you see here. Amplification is going to net us the most single target damage numbers. Shimmer is our best mobility option on this row. Slipstream is also an alternative, but I prefer Shimmer. Rune of Power because Arcane is bursty and has that strong CD that we would like to make even stronger. We'll take Resonance for the most consistent AoE since Arcane Barrage is a very common ability that we will be using. This tier is pretty close, but since we cast Arcane Barrage a lot, I take Chrono Shift. It can also help with mobility since it makes you quicker. On this row, Arcane Orb is the most useful for single target and for AoE, and it also has very respectable damage, so it's the best pick. Now for the last tier, it's between Enlightened and Overpowered. It's a little bit close, but I believe if you are a Night Fae and even potentially the Arcane Prodigy Conduit, you can get some nice cooldown reduction on Arcane Power. So I believe it's better to run our Overpowered. There is only one legendary I would take at this current moment in Mythic Plus, and it is Arcane Bombardment, which increases Arcane Barrage on mobs below 35% HP, giving us an execute, an AoE execute in some cases. Pair this with the talent Resonance, and you can get some crazy numbers on Barrage, especially when it crits. This legendary comes from Torghast and is on the feet and the cloak, so keep an eye out for it in the next couple weeks. For Trinkets, Kabbalist's Hymnal, which comes from Raid, is a for sure lock-in for Arcane. The second trinket that we want to use would have to be an on-use trinket. Trinkets like Macabre Sheet Music, Soul Letting Ruby, Inscrutable Quantum Device, and the PvP Badge are all viable on-use trinkets. To me, Soul Letting Ruby sounds very attractive because of all that crit. Any of these trinkets could be viable for Mythic Plus, just as long as you have an on-use. Now when it comes to Soulbinds, I'd have to say overall Khura'in is the best because of his increased damage amp above 75% HP targets. So if you're Arcane, you have an execute below 35% with a legendary, and an anti-execute at 75% HP and above. However, I believe Naya is close simply because of the mastery buff, and mastery is not a bad stat for Arcane at all. Early on you don't have much options, so using Naya is good until you can try out Khura'in fully unlocked. Currently, I would avoid using Dreamweaver, because the haste that Dreamweaver gives, Arcane cannot make good use of it. Nor does Arcane even like haste in the first place. In my opinion, Arcane actually has a lot of balance between their conduits. We have Arcane Prodigy, which makes our clear casted missiles give you cooldown reduction on your Arcane Power. I like this one the most because it changes gameplay a bit, and sometimes can be the difference of you having Arcane Power for a pull or not. Then we have Magi's Brand, which accumulates more damage in your touch of the Magi window. Nether Precision, increasing your Arcane Blast after clear casting. Artifice of the Archmage, refunding you arcane charges when you arcane barrage. In my opinion, I preferred Arcane Prodigy and Magi's Brand as a pair, because these two translate well into single target and into AoE, while Nether Precision and Artifice are strictly single target or strictly AoE. This does not mean the other two conduits are bad though. Artifice specifically can be great for a full AoE build. Stats are always a tricky part, especially in the beginning of expansions, because Intellect is rated as a very high stat. Most of the time, you will be taking item level, which is something we don't normally do. Also, each character's gear and race are different, so always download Simulation Craft add-on and head to raidbots.com and see what pieces are best for you. What I noticed about my own stat weights was crit and mastery were simming great on single target, and crit mastery and verse simmed great on AoE. When I sim for Mythic Plus, I sim 1 target, 2 minutes, turning off Lust, and for AoE, 5 to 7 targets, 40 seconds or 1 minute, depending on how fast you'll think you'll kill the pack, and I also turn off Lust. If you want to turn off Arcane Power and see what your sim looks like without cooldowns, then use this line right here. I will leave it in the description below. Your enchants are going to look similar to fire, besides the ring enchants. Arcane prefers crit and mastery generally, so I'd sim your highest stat, and see which ring enchants are for you. For Mythic Plus, we take Celestial Guidance because it's got good value in single target and in AoE. I take the Leech Cloak enchant, but unless you want to survive one-shots, you can take Avoidance. Eternal Intellect to Bracers, and Eternal Stats to Chest. The consumables are the same as Fire as well. We have 5 buffs we can put on ourselves before starting keys, not counting Arcane Intellect. Flask, Food, Augment Rune, Armor Kit, and Weapon Oil. And for potions, we have Phantom Fire for single target on bosses, and Spectral Intellect Potion for AoE Arcane Powers. Use your potion on cooldown for either of those 2 scenarios. The only real benefit of professions is being an engineer and being able to battle res your friends. Or you can put a small absorb on yourself, or turn yourself invisible using the engineering belt enchants. Unless I need invis for a certain skip, I'm always going to run the absorb belt as it's its own separate 10-minute cooldown, and with my current gear, absorbs 4.6k HP. The biggest changes to Arcane from BFA to Shadowlands are the talents have been rearranged and some new ones have been added. Arcane Echo looks solid for single target, and Arcane Orb has been readjusted to a different tier, making it a playable talent because previously it competed with Overpowered. Presence of Mind now affects 3 Arcane Blasts when it was 2 in BFA. Clearcasting missiles stack up to 3 times instead of 1, and Arcane Power is now a 2-minute cooldown. Touch of the Magi has also been made baseline and combined with Charged Up, the BFA talent. Oh, and lastly, we have Mana Gem back. Now on to the basics of Arcane. Arcane is a spec that uses mana as a resource as well as arcane charges. There are 2 ways to build arcane charges: Arcane Blast and Arcane Explosion. One is single target and one is AoE. When you gain arcane charges, Arcane Blast costs more mana, deals more damage, and gets a faster cast. Arcane Explosion is the same mana cost and damage regardless of arcane charges. Arcane Barrage clears these arcane charges when used, and based on the amount of charges you have, will replenish more mana, do more damage, and cleave another target per charge, up to 5 targets total. We also have Arcane Missiles, which is an ability that procs off of Arcane Explosion, Arcane Blast, or missiles itself, granting you clear casting. You can use missiles without a clear casting proc, but it's a rare scenario. Most of the time, you will use it with a clear casting proc on 1 or 2 targets. I'll touch up on that in my Arcane Missile section later on in the video. So before I talk about all the little mini cooldowns that Arcane has, I'm going to quickly explain the Arcane single target opener, Arcane single target without cooldowns and conserving, AoE opener, and AoE without cooldowns. Your single target arcane power goes as follows: precast Touch of the Magi, press arcane power in your trinkets and racials, arcane blast 3 times, sometimes 4 depending on haste. As soon as you see Touch of the Magi has 3 seconds left, you want to Presence of Mind and try to fit in 3 arcane blasts at the end. If you have a missiles proc, using it into Magi is good, but you must cancel the missiles early if it'll interfere with you squeezing in those last 3 Presence of Mind arcane blasts. After Magi, you can spam arcane blast till the end of your arcane power. Use Arcane Barrage at the last global and arcane power. This will drop your stacks, so you'll Rune if it's up, and then Arcane Orb to get your stacks back. This is a quick example of how it would look. If you get missiles, you always use it in AP. If you want to see my cast timeline, look at the top of the screen for my cast timeline recore. So outside of cooldowns after that arcane power, on single target, the general rule is if you have Evocation up, you want to dump your mana, using every clear casting proc on the way to you as you burn your mana to 0. When it is burned to 0, you want to Evocation up to full. One of the best times to use Shifting Power is when it can get Arcane Power, Rune of Power, Touch of the Magi, Evocation, etc. A lot of those mini cooldowns that Arcane has, Shifting Power can recharge and get good value from. To conserve your mana and go mana positive on single target, you want to Arcane Blast just enough to get 4 stacks of Arcane charges and Barrage. You want to make sure you can conserve your mana on single target for your next Arcane Power. Unless for some reason you have Evocation up, then you can go crazy. On AoE, this is where Arcane becomes very simple. The Arcane Power AoE opener goes as follows: Precast Touch, pop AP, Racials and Trinkets, Barrage, Arcane Orb, Barrage, And after that, you Explosion till 4 stacks, and Barrage when you get that 4 stacks. If you do a mini burn without Arcane Power, but you have Rune of Power ready, just replace Arcane Power with Rune of Power in this same rotation. This right here is a sample AoE rotation with Arcane Power. If you were not talented into Arcane Orb, you would just keep Explosioning. Outside of cooldowns, it gets even easier. Basically, you are just counting your arcane charges to 4 by Arcane Exploding and barraging every time at 4. The only time you would keep Arcane Exploding at 4 stacks is if you are 1 or 2 globals till your target is below 35%, to barrage it and benefit from the Arcane Bombardment legendary. You want to use Rune of Power on AoE and try to find a time to use 1 touch of the Magi in between Arcane Powers. Also remember on AoE to use Arcane Orb on CD and at 0 arcane charges. Arcane Orb generates 1 stack and 1 more for each target it hits. If it hits 3 targets, then you'll get full arcane stacks every time. Use this on cooldown to maximize arcane barrages. And always look to arcane barrage targets below 35% HP, no matter what. The good thing about arcane AoE is that you don't really worry about your mana at all, because arcane barraging that much in AoE keeps your mana very healthy. With the legendary, they have insanely good sustained AoE damage, meaning they do not rely on cooldowns to do good AoE. It is always very pug friendly, meaning you do not need to be pulled around. Every spell you cast is instant, so you have great mobility in AoE, but beware, you might deal with melee mechanics, or even the increased aggro generation that melee get. In this next section, I'm going to recap all of the little arcane cooldowns and how to use them. The first one is Arcane Orb. On single target, you use Arcane Orb as either a movement global or a way to get stacks back after arcane barraging to drop your stacks. On AoE, you use it on cooldown at 0 stacks to get 4 stacks instantly for another arcane barrage. If possible, try to use this inside Rune of Powers, because this ability does respectable damage. Using this with Arcane Power is also really, really good. Evocation is one of your main single target cooldowns because mana is barely a problem on AoE. Generally, on single target bosses, you want to use it after you burn your mana to 0. So the best way to use this in Mythic Plus is to save it for bosses, 1 or 2 mob pulls, or mobs like Prideful. If you are fighting Prideful in Mythic Plus, you absolutely must put this ability on cooldown, because killing Prideful gives you the mana regen buff for 1 minute. Presence of Mind is one of our mini single target cooldowns. Using this on bosses and single target with Arcane Power is ideal. However, in Mythic Plus, sometimes your Arcane Power is full on AoE, meaning you don't use this with every AP. The best times to use this are in single target mobs or Prideful or bosses. You don't really want to use this on 3+ targets, so if you're AoEing, it is okay if Presence of Mind is up, just wait for the single target to come. Simultaneously, try to line this up with AP for your boss fights. Rune of Power is something you kind of want to use on cooldown. If you just finished your Arcane Power in single target, then use Rune and dump your mana. If you just finished Arcane Power on AoE, and you think the mobs will live the full duration of it, then Rune again and keep Arcane Exploding. If you don't think it will live the full duration, then hold for next pack. Most likely, you'll have your Magi up for it. Touch of the Magi is pretty much something you want to look to sync Arcane Power with. The openers I explained earlier, it is ideal to have Magi with them. Magi is a 45-second cooldown, so you can find a time to comfortably use 1 touch of the Magi in between your Arcane Powers. 2 if you have to hold your cooldown for some random reason, but usually just 1. If Rune is not up, but using touch will get you that extra use in between your Arcane Power, then go for it. Conjure Mana Gem is another mini single target cooldown, and it follows the same rules of Presence of Mind in Mythic Plus as to when to use it. I would avoid using this on AoE and focus on using it on bosses, single target, and Prideful. Always use it early on in your burn and before your Evocate. Also, remember to actually make the item before your key or raid starts, as sometimes even I forget. It has 3 charges and restores 10% mana, so make sure you get the full value when you use it. For example, don't use it at 95% mana. The most optimal way to use Shifting Power is to produce all these mini cooldowns that I've just talked about. Using it for Arcane Power is the main goal, but trying to hit as many of these little cooldowns as possible is great value. On single target, I use it usually after my burn into Evocate. On AoE, sometimes when the pack is about to die, and I think that shifting power will give me another Arcane Orb into Barrage. You can also use it out of combat to recharge things like Touch of the Magi and Rune of Power for a mini cooldown phase. Now when it comes to Arcane Blast and Arcane Explosion, this is somewhat similar to Fire's Flame Strike vs Pyroblast situation. On 3+ targets in cooldowns, you will use Arcane Explosion Opener. On 2+ targets in cooldowns, you will use Arcane Blast Opener. Outside of cooldowns on 2 targets, Arcane Blast and Arcane Explosion are very close to each other, but I believe if you have the Arcane Bombardment legendary, it makes sense to use Arcane Explosion, as it will generate the most Arcane Barrages rapidly. If there is a priority target, then Arcane Blasting is the way. On single target, for Arcane Blast vs Arcane Missiles, you pretty much only use missiles if you have a clear casting proc. Arcane Blast will be used otherwise. However, there are times when you can use missiles without procs. The best times to do this are on single target, when you've already barraged to dump your arcane charge stacks, and the mob is about to die. Casting a couple missiles into this is better than doing 1 or 2 stack arcane blasts, especially if the mob is about to die. When it comes to clear casted missiles, I believe it is safe to use it up to 3 targets, and sometimes 4 targets if you have a clear casting proc. Because of this conduit, sometimes casting those clear casting missiles will be the difference of you having arcane power in the next pull or not. Forcing your cooldown to come back with this conduit is very strong, especially when you fight Prideful, as you have a lot of time and single target clear casting procs to recharge arcane power. Arcane has a huge benefit, specifically to this season of Mythic Plus. When you kill Prideful, the seasonal fix, you get a mana regen buff. This benefits Arcane so much because if you play around Prideful to have it up for single target, then Arcane will destroy bosses, as well as destroying AoE with that legendary. If you can advise your group to have a route where you have Prideful for bosses, then it is a huge benefit. In this clip, 1 minute later, I'm literally still full mana without using Evocate or Mana Gem. I promise you with this buff on single target, you will have so much fun. So real quick, 2 more things to talk about and then we're done. One is that, remember Arcane is a spec that needs to be in melee to properly AoE, so make sure you think about this when you cast things like Rune of Power, as you want to be in range of the mobs and your rune. One small tip is use Shimmer with your precasted Touch of the Magi, or your precasted Rune of Power, whatever it is, to position yourself in melee, like so. And to wrap this up, Arcane is a burst class similar to Fire Mage, so we can have aggro problems, but Arcane can somewhat deal with it better. We have Mirror's Image, where if you have it up, you must cast it pre-pull, before you're about to go crazy on Arcane Power AoE. It will protect you from aggro. Arcane also has Greater Invis, which is instant cast Vanish and a shorter cooldown, which is unlike the Fire or Frost version. Because it is instant, you can use it to drop threat very easily. I hope this video was helpful to you guys, and I swear I am so happy with the state of Arcane right now. I say this many times, I believe it is on par or just a sliver behind Fire in Mythic Plus, especially once you get that Arcane Bombardment legendary. So do not be surprised when you start seeing Arcane Mages in your groups. The damage they do is real and it's good. Thank you guys for watching, see you next time.